we're being served by the Human Service Center. Well, we got the people at the Human Service Center got a call from the governor's office, and they were instructed that they would help find these people a place to live because they had been even evicted from the homeless shelter at the time. So there was a group of us that got together and we rented a fairly small home, and these two moved in there. And when we rented the house, we told the owner of the home that there was a history of some damage to the property, but that we would take financial the responsibility so that if there were any damages made to the property, that we would put that back in order before we did not rent the apartment. And we rented it in our name, and then the clients rented it from us. So it was a sublease type of situation. And when we agreed to it, there were some financial promises made by the other agencies involved. So it was not all on Prairie Harvest to make the repairs, but we did the day-to-day work with the clients to try and keep them successful in that housing. So when they first moved in, of course, they had a voucher, and you know, at that time, the pet policies were just coming into play as a landlord. So these two had requested that they wanted a pet. So we explained to them what the policy was, that the pets had to be vaccinated, and we approved that they could get one animal, and they chose a rat. So we said the rat had to be kept in a cage, it had to be vaccinated. We had our policy at that time. And so they agreed to that. And keep in mind that their home was, once they were there, they started the hoarding process. So there were piles of clothes and garbage. It was pretty disorganized, and they wouldn't always let staff in, which, was their, they could do that. And so we would have to serve them maybe outside of their home. Um, so anyway, they got this rat, and then they told us that the rat got lonely, so they got a second rat. Well, lo and behold, these two rats were, one was a male and one was a female. Well, then they said that the rats were part of their family, so they let them run loose in the house. And they had a family, so there were baby rats, and I wouldn't venture to say, but I'm guessing it was close to 20. And these baby rats and the mother and father rat were running free in the house. They had burrowed into a mattress on the floor, and there was feces all over everything. So housing came in and did an inspection, and of course they failed the inspection. So we made an agreement with them that we would put them in a hotel and that we would clean the house up, and then they agreed that they would get rid of their pets. So we had an exterminator come in and removed all of the rats that they could find, and then we had to take all of the furniture, and it was burned, and there were rat carcasses in the mattress and box spring. So it kind of gives you the heebie-jeebies, but what it's showing is that there are some people that have a real extreme case of hoarding, and this was one of those cases. Well, so after we exterminated it, I think they were in a hotel for 2 weeks. Then we had to get it completely cleaned, vents and everything, and got it back to a livable order. And then we agreed that we would go in there more often and just do some testing and, checking to make sure that they were keeping things a little more orderly. So we had told them, at that time, it would not be probably the best idea to get a pet for a while. And they agreed that they would not. So one day, one of our staff went over there and they were talking about how are you going to organize these piles of clothes. And well, they had made promises that they would keep things neater. And all of a sudden, a shirt came hopping across the living room, and the one of the people who lived there picked the shirt up, and there was a great big bullfrog hopping across the living room. So they had found a new pet from outside, but then they agreed that they would let that one go. So, there's a lot of issues where um, you might think you're making some baby steps and then you might take a few steps back. But even if we, we had other concerns with them as well. They were very difficult to treat, but we tried to measure if this was successful housing for them. And they lived in that house for 5 years. So we would, like I said, they would get 6-month housing inspections. We would help. We'd work with them and hire outside cleaning companies to come in. We'd get it cleaned up, painted, and then during that time while they were living there, we purchased the house. And then there was not an outside landlord that would have to deal with this issue. So we kept it in pretty good repair. So they lived there for 5 years, and then they had somewhat of a work history. One of them did when they lived there. And then after that time, there was a falling out between the two, and they moved away. So that kind of took care of of that issue. But I think that during that time, we worked with some skill building with them, and things got a little less difficult to manage over the years. So that was kind of an extreme case of hoarding. And then there are other cases where people ask if it's, like they might say, well, their mother is a hoarder. And, people get kind of some problems in their family if they have someone who doesn't keep their house clean, or it's assumed that it's not clean because there's stacks of things all over. So what we try and tell people is that there's a difference between hoarding and collecting. And I have a friend who's a collector, and I friends for many years and was never allowed in her house. And finally, one day I was invited in, and I went in there, and that house was so full of items. But what the difference is her items were fairly neat and organized. There was just a lot of it, and they make a lot of purchases. They don't like to get rid of any of their collections. So there's just a difference that way. But just to wrap things up, that's a couple of examples for you. The best advice, again, like I said, is therapy. It's always good to find someone who specializes in hoarding. So my suggestion is to try and get, if you have a family member who you think is hoarding, try and get them to see a therapist, and then perhaps they would get them into some type of um, therapy that would, like cognitive behavioral therapy, something like that, that would help them work on building the skills um, and improving. And there are a few meds that have proven to be somewhat helpful, although it's not as helpful as the therapy. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle or to Nikki.
Michelle, is it my turn?
Yeah, you're on, Nikki. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Nikki Green. I'm the Director of Intake here at High Plains. And thanks, Deb, for all those examples and for the really detailed explanation of just how hoarding might look for folks who come into that situation. In terms of my end, in terms of the intake end, the intake for us, when we would become involved or notified, is it's usually would come from either the actual individual themselves. They experience some sort of adverse outcome or consequence from their landlord or property management company, or a family member that's concerned about somebody and maybe an infraction, or somebody like Deb who works with the person, is a case provider or a services provider of some kind. Again, like I said, it's usually prompted by an infraction or an eviction or a non-renewal that's related to, they might write hoarding on there. They may just say it's because you have a lot of stuff, it's a fire hazard. Those are the things that I usually hear, especially the fire hazard. And as Deb said, I found a good definition that I think was helpful. It's important to distinguish between lots of stuff, like collecting, like Deb said, and hoarding. So the article that I was reading made the distinction that it's important to distinguish between a messy home and hoarding. A messy home might not be indicative of hoarding if the home is still safe to move around in, and if the rooms are used in the manner that they're originally intended to be used for. So if you have, a lot of cans, dry goods, non-perishables in your kitchen, that doesn't mean that you're a hoarder. It might just mean for some reason you like to stock up. You like to collect that. You makes it feel better about that. And so, like we said, hoarding is recognized as a disability under the Fair Housing Act. And when an individual or a case provider would reach out to us or their family, usually, like I said, they want us to deal with the infraction. They want us to help them with the infraction. So the tricky part here comes in whether or not the individual who is, if they actually have hoarding disorder, if they're willing to accept that definition or willing to agree to that diagnosis. It's difficult for us to use that disability protected class if the person is not willing to say, yeah, that would be my designation. As we all know, there is some kind of negative societal stereotypes related to that. So that becomes one area that's a little bit difficult for us. But assuming that they agree that that is what's happening and that they're willing to make a change, the next step would be that we get consent from them to act as their advocate. And so I believe you all are mostly landlords. So that would be the point at which we would reach out to you. So we would act as the individual's advocate. We would call the landlord or the management company and say, I understand they got an infraction. I understand that they have an eviction or non-renewal. How can we help them? And how can we help you to come to some sort of resolution? So like Michelle wrote on her presentation, there was an example of a reasonable accommodation. That would be what we'd usually do next. So we would ask for more time. And that would relate to the provision of the lease that would usually ask for an eviction or a non-renewal if the person did XYZ, which would be the hoarding. So usually that reasonable accommodation that would be requested is more time for the individual to obtain the appropriate supportive or mental health services that will allow them to bring the unit into compliance with the lease provision or policy. And as Deb stated, this will usually require care coordination of the support team. And as Deb also said, it's going to probably include some steps forward and some steps back. And there may be some recidivism. And that's why it's really important to involve that whole support team so that they can put together a plan for maybe regular professional cleanings or a family member that helps in the regular inspections like Deb was mentioning, that kind of thing. So that would be what usually happens from my end, is that somebody calls me, I get their permission, act on their behalf to reach out to the management company, try to get them a little bit more time or a reasonable accommodation to try to prevent their loss of housing.
Great, thank you, Nikki. Well, I think that sort of wraps up what we had to say. If there's any questions that anyone has regarding hoarding or regarding the work that we do, feel free to ask them in the chat area now.
We have a few questions.
All right.
What happens when the smell from hoarding begins to interfere with other tenants?
That's Deb, do you want to take it or do you want me to take it?
Well, one of the things that would happen would be, of course, there's going to be a complaint to the landlord because you are affecting someone else's enjoyment of their place to live. So actually, that is legitimate, because no matter who you are, you're still responsible as an adult for keeping things safe for your neighbors. So a lot of times that's where the threat to evict will come in. And then, that's where if we were working with the people, we can help get those cleaning services in there, in whatever manner that means. And also take steps to get them into some type of therapy. We usually work in partnership with Northeast, so they have the therapeutic staff to help with those types of issues, and do some type of therapy. Now, a lot of times when fair housing gets involved, it's come to the point where they might have been given, say, 2 weeks to get it cleaned up. A lot of times there's depression that's involved with that. So it's really hard for someone to have the ability to organize their thoughts enough to really get it done. So the reasonable accommodation could come in there if they needed a little more time, but agreed to get some help. But yes, I agree that there is going to be an odor involved, because a lot of times there's rotten food and different varieties of things that may be in their apartment or their home. So sometimes it's outside.
Right.
Wow.
And that is the tricky part. Like Nikki said, is that somebody may get a non-renewal, and then it's only after Nikki's been working with the client for a while when they realize that there may be a hoarding disorder. But if the person doesn't accept that diagnosis, then we as a fair housing organization can't request a reasonable accommodation. So that is really tricky.
Next question. Does a landlord have to take a person that has been evicted from another landlord for unsafe hoarding?
Right. So that is, and Nikki can answer this as well, but that kind of speaks a little bit to the question or to the presentation that I made with one of the reasonable accommodations, that if the tenant asks for a reasonable accommodation to, and if the tenant proves that they have the hoarding under control and they ask for a reasonable accommodation to, to ignore or to put aside that part of their references to meet the qualifications, then, then I think as a landlord, you would need to at least enter into that interactive process to see that, so perhaps that tenant could live there. But I can't say for sure if you have to enter. It's really a case-by-case basis. And Nikki, do you have any other questions?
I think that a couple people are asking on the chat kind of similar questions that are related to that. So I think, I mean, since we're not legal professionals, we can't really tell you whether or not you have to take somebody as a tenant. So that would be up to you. But know that if they have hoarding disorder, and if that's the reason that they have gotten that infraction or gotten that poor reference, and then they ask you to have a reasonable accommodation to sort of put aside that requirement, then you may be discriminating if you decide not to grant that reasonable accommodation. We say may because maybe there are other aspects to it that would allow you to do that, and what legal folks would say that was all right. And there's a couple people asking in the chat about whether we help landlords with people who have hoarding disorder, or people who have a lot of stuff, that kind of thing. So the answer is yes and no. So you can definitely call us and we can do our best, but we likely would have to talk to the actual individual, because we would not be asking for a reasonable accommodation for that person without their consent. So you know, if you wanted to refer that individual to call us, definitely, that would be great. And if you wanted to get some, you know, ideas or opinions or discussion about reasonable accommodations or how you could approach it, definitely. But we wouldn't be able to act in that person's behalf unless that person reached out to us. And then there's some other people asking about how much time is too much time, because the reality of roach and rodent infestations just is too real. There's additional time. How likely are they to accept the hoarding diagnosis? You know, I'm not certain how likely someone would accept the hoarding diagnosis, but again, on the other side, as a landlord and management side, it's not, you don't really have to worry about whether or not they're going to accept the diagnosis. That would be on them. That would be on their side. If they decide that they have a disability, or, you know, their provider says they have a disability and that this reasonable accommodation is needed, then they would go forward. I don't think you have to necessarily worry about the social part of that. I'm not sure of the answer of that. I don't know statistically. And then as how much time is too much time? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. Wouldn't you say, Michelle, Deb? I guess I don't think there's a hard and fast, always 6 weeks or always 2 months or whatever.
No, and I guess, you know, I can understand where if, you know, because we owned that house that I was talking about, and it really is a concern because it does get worse as time goes on. But if you can, you know, like with what we did is we had some funding where we could actually have them move out of the unit and just completely cleaned it. And I know not everyone can do that, but if you talk to, you know, the person that's in there, they may be able to access some resources where they can get help. You know, like for the same type of accommodation where they could get moved out and get rid of the infestation as quickly as you can. So I certainly understand that. It's, you know, like I said, it gives you the heebie-jeebies, but it's also a matter of health. And we take that very seriously. So no, I think that's a good question. You know, it's hard to say how much time is too much time because of, you know, just it depends on it. Actually, around here, it depends on weather, what's available, where you can move them to, and the resources that are available, and if they have some professional help that can help them get organized. So it all is just kind of a balancing act. But you know, these very extreme cases are pretty few and far between. You know, a lot of people who are hoarding, it doesn't go quite this far, because even when you know, watch the show Hoarders on television, that's the very worst that you're ever going to see. So, and I know there have been a handful of cases in Grand Forks. It's a difficult issue. So
I think progress is important too, and making a plan. So if you're if you're as a landlord giving them more time, and then you show up, you know, a week later, and nothing has changed, and they've made no movement toward changing, or they have no plan set up, that kind of thing. I think then at that point, then it becomes more of an ultimatum of get a plan figured out, get an, you know, some sort of action in place from a care team. If that makes sense. I think that progress is important, and forward movement.
Right. And I think that letter, you know, that kind of sample reasonable accommodation letter made it really clear, like the first thing we'll do, or the first thing I'll do asking for more time, is to clear an emergency path. The second thing I'll do is, you know, start to do the bedroom in kitchen. And, you know, within 6 weeks, I will have the living room, you know, managed. So I think in that, you know, maybe 6 weeks seems too long if there is a rodent or a bullfrog infestation. But yeah, that idea of time bounded, you know, in the reasonable accommodation, time bounded, and then, you know, looking and checking in on that progress. So that would be, you know, I think some key ways to think about it.
Let's see. If the rats get into another unit, who is responsible for taking care of the exterminator?
I think that, Nikki, is that is that dependent on the lease usually?
That's what I was going to say. What is the terms of the pest eradication that's listed in the lease? Because I mean, it could be, if I don't want to compare it to this, but what about like bed bugs or something? If somebody brings bed bugs to a unit and it can be proved that they started them, which is very difficult, but then it probably already has something in the lease provisions about that. Because otherwise somebody might say, well, there might be rats all around. They didn't come from my unit. So it would be tricky. You would have to get an exterminator involved and get an exterminator to be able to say which unit started it. And then you'd have to look to what your lease states about pest eradication, I think.
And then Deb, it looks like Emily has a question. What other resources are available that they have at the Grand Forks Public Housing Authority? They have many households that face hoarding issues, and they're typically unable to find any services to assist in cleaning and bringing the unit up to standards. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts would be, like working in conjunction with Northeast Human Service Center, because a lot of the people, we're limited, like at Prairie Harvest, with the people we serve come to us as a referral from Northeast Human Service Center. But they have, a lot of therapeutic people that could help. So I think probably checking with Northeast Human Service Center would be one option. There are some other agencies, that probably have a funding. I know there was a fund that was going to become available to help landlords get their units back in shape. There may be some funding that way, and I don't know if that was through Money Follows the Person. I might be speaking out of turn. And then, sometimes the other social service agencies here in town might have some type of funding that can be utilized for that. I know a lot of times we work with the housing authority. So, I know with Emily, we work with their maintenance unit to help us with a lot of those situations. But it is a matter of finding the funding to get those units in shape, because it's very costly. So, with us, we were able to collaborate with, there were 3 of us that found the funding available when we had to clean up that infestation with the rats. So it just kind of sometimes, like I said, it takes a village. You might just have to, there might be something even at United Way or, those types of agencies that could help with that. I don't know if that helped, but just some suggestions.
There's another comment / question in the chat box. I realize you are advocates, but is there a new definition as to what type of animal can be classified as a therapy animal? Since the HUD law was changed in January of this year, that a landlord cannot charge a pet deposit or more for rent for a therapy animal.
Right. I was actually just looking that up so I can attach it to everyone. And I'm trying to figure out how I can do that. They did. So it's still assistance animals are not considered pets. They cannot be charged a pet fee. But they did not specify what types of animals, but they did say that exotic animals may not be considered. Is that correct, Nikki?
Yeah, and it's kind of, again, based on a case-by-case basis. So if, for instance, someone has a severe allergy to, your common emotional support animals, then they may be allowed to have a different one. But if you read that HUD guidance, it's fairly specific and clear about what animals would be okay or what animals might be a little bit more odd, or you might need some additional documentation explaining why. But I did want to say, what Michelle was just saying, I don't know if we made that clear enough, that that wasn't a change. So it wasn't a change that you can't require a pet deposit for an assistance animal. That has been the case for a long time. So I see, wouldn't a snake, rat, or bullfrog be exotic? I do think those would be unusual. So I think that would be important. If you look at that guidance again, I'll open that guidance and I'll link to maybe to the right page on that. Does that sound helpful to folks? I'll find the exact box that has to do with that.
Yeah, and actually rats can be really trainable. They're more trainable than cats. So I think rats may not be exotic.
Yeah,
but,
yep, you're right. Both the bullfrog or snake might be a little
yeah,
bit.
right. Anyway, are there any other questions? Great. Well, feel free to call us and contact us if you have any questions. We gave you Prairie Harvest's website, but you can contact us if you can't find Deb.
Unique animals, sorry to interrupt you, but before we
Yep.
cancel, log off real quick. Unique animals is on page 12 and then page 13 of that. So it does talk about unique animals would be the requester, so the tenant has the substantial burden of demonstrating the disability related therapeutic need for the specific animal or specific type of animal. And it would have to, they'd be encouraged to support documentation from a healthcare professional confirming the need for this animal. And if you look onto the box on page 13, it talks about a reasonable accommodation might be necessary for a unique animal for unique circumstances, like the animal is individually trained to do work or perform tasks that cannot be provided by a dog. Like for instance, on that one, like a monkey or something, because they're able to use their hands to do something that a dog wouldn't be able to do. Or information from a healthcare professional confirms that allergies would prevent the person from using a dog, or I would put a cat there as well. So it just, oh yeah, and then they talk about a capuchin monkey. So.
Great.
I've got one more question for you. In the reasonable accommodation, can the landlord put a stipulation that they must go to some type of therapy, or would that be discrimination?
Okay, so probably they can always enter into an interactive process. I think if we were advocating for the client and the client, we might not, we probably would think that that would be maybe discriminatory, you know, kind of adding for too much. But I mean, there's certainly, you can do a case, you know, in a case by case basis, do that interactive process.
And I think that would usually come on the part of the individual. They would usually offer that to the landlord as a possible, you know, remediation kind of thing. That's how they're going to show that they're going to make progress on cleaning up or something. Because it'd be like putting extra terms and conditions on someone to require them to go to therapy, and then really how beneficial would therapy be if somebody was forced to do it? And I think that might even be like illegal,
Right.
you know, not even related to the fair housing, but to force somebody to do something.
Yeah, that's what I wasn't sure, because in the accommodation, that person kind of has the upper hand, that the landlord is really limited on what they can do, you know, to turn the person away. They can't say we can't do the reasonable accommodation.
Well, I can see how it would feel that way. I definitely, and I do think that it becomes a really tricky, the interactive process is a little bit tricky, but the importance of the interactive process is so that the individual can kind of tell the landlord how best, or what is best to help them with their disability. So, I mean, I wouldn't know what Susie Q needed for her disability, but if she told me she was going to do, you know, these 3 things and then she didn't do them, then me as a landlord, I then have the right to say, hey, you said you were going to do these 3 things and you're not making any progress. You're not doing the 3 things. So, you know, now my non-renewal is back in effect, you know? So in a way, the landlord still does hold that power, because they still have the ability to do the non-renewal or the eviction or whatever it was that was the initial threat. But the person has the ability to show what would be good for them, for the symptoms of their disability, and what they could do to help ameliorate that infraction. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, we look at a perfect hour. That's excellent. We're so efficient. Well, thank you all again. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions, and we'll be, we're here ready to take your call. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Remember, if you need a certificate to contact Marilyn, and then we ask that you please fill out the survey for part of our grant. So Marilyn will be sending that out shortly. Thank you very much.
Cheryl?
Yep.
Don't quite exit out. I just responded to somebody with a question.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure she got it.
I don't know who was talking, but I'm still on here. So I just responded back to you. But that is a reasonable modification if they have to change the structure of a unit for the individual for their disability. And so the cost of that is determined by a number of factors. Oftentimes the cost of the reasonable modification can be passed on to the client, but it depends on what funding source the property management uses. I don't know if you're still there, the person who was wondering.
Yeah, I think she's still on there.
Okay, so I did put my email on there if you want to reach out to me for more specifics, or on our website, we do have information about reasonable modifications. So there is like the HUD DOJ guidance on there already that is for reasonable modifications, and you can feel free to check that out. But there are some properties, like I said, that have accepted federal funding when they built the property. And so that sort of requires them for X amount of years to pay for reasonable modifications that are needed.
Okay, that looks
So
like
let me know if you need more. Okay, thank you. Take care, y'all.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.